So we're looking at Queen Elizabeth in the golden age of Tudor England. And here she is, Queen Elizabeth herself. There are different understandings of her, especially I think as a woman, her nature as a woman. And we'll see something about that as we go through. If you look at your print, at the end of your print, you might notice something just to, okay, history can be a bit boring sometimes, so, all right. Yeah. Look at the very end of the print. There's a fun question at the end, okay? Just to make sure you're all awake. Yeah. Okay. All right. So, in her childhood, well, that's a pretty unusual life for you, isn't it? That not many people today are going to say, well, what happened to your mother? Oh, she had her head chopped off. I mean, it's not something that's likely to occur, at least here in Japan or in Britain in these days. And because the king had done that, he also declared that the daughter was illegitimate, which meant that she would not have any right to become queen or inherit any property of the king's when the king died. But there were some people around her who liked the little girl and who wanted to take care of her, especially these women, her governesses. A governess was like a kind of home tutor, but they would educate children, little boys and little girls, especially, obviously, only in high-class families because poor people couldn't afford such an education. And so she was looked after by these people. And she got an incredibly good education. She learned at an early age French, Flemish, that's kind of like Dutch or the language they speak in Holland, Italian, Spanish. William Grindal was her next teacher, and the next one was a particularly famous educationist of the 16th century, Roger Ascham. He's very well known as not just a teacher, but as somebody who wrote books about teaching and somebody who advanced education in that period. And the result was that by the time she was 18, she was one of the most educated and one of the most intelligent women in the whole of Europe. So she had a difficult time as a child. She probably never really remembered her, probably too young to remember her mother very well at all, but she did get an extremely good education. And one of the things that children, little girls, would be taught to do in those days was to embroider. This went through right into the 19th century. You'd see embroidery done by children and grown-up women as well. It's like a work of art, really. She did this as the cover of a book at the age of 11. All right, so she was very skillful with the needle. But more than that, she wrote the book. Well, she didn't write, she translated the book at the age of 11. It's what we call a commonplace book, which means it's a book written by hand. It's not a printed book. She wrote it in her beautiful handwriting, and she gave it to Catherine Parr, we'll hear a little bit more about her later on. So she gave it to a woman who was kind of acting like a mother for her. Clever child, obviously, at that early age. And she went on through life to show herself to be a very, very clever woman. But as I say, well, the first and obvious huge trauma is her mother having her head chopped off. She was 2 years and 8 months old. And as Alison Plowden says, she would never be able to remember a time when she had not known that her mother had died because her father ordered it. What a situation. Okay? Pretty horrific. And yeah, she was probably too young to remember much about it, but only a few years later, when she was old enough now at the age of 8 to see and understand and remember, Henry did the same thing to another wife. So her father had another woman's head chopped off. So for Elizabeth, probably those two events, the second one would reinforce the first one. It must have been a big impression on her all through her life that this had happened in her childhood. We'll go on to find that, of course, Elizabeth never married, and I think quite often people feel that this is going to be part of the reason. She didn't have a very good experience of married men. In fact, she was going to have other more traumatic experiences that perhaps also had a negative effect on her feelings towards men. So, yes, Catherine Parr was looking after her like a mother from the death of Henry Hengedi-Hassé. Her father died in 1546, and from that time on, she was staying with Catherine Parr, who had been Henry's last wife. Catherine married Thomas Seymour. You notice the connections of the names. Anne Seymour was another of the Henry's wives, and Thomas seems to have. It seems pretty clear from the way the situation is described that he abused her. So pretty tough for a child. Okay. Her first mother her mother has her head chopped off. Her father's later wife is also beheaded, and then she herself is abused sexually. So I would say, you don't need a lot of imagination or empathy to think, yeah, it must have been difficult for her to have relationships with men and so on. Again, there are quite a lot of theories about Elizabeth's relationships with men. I think some historians believe that she did actually have deep sexual relationships with men. She just never married any of them. Other people say, no, she really was the Virgin Queen that she was supposed to be, that she presented herself as. It's difficult to get at the truth, but I suspect the ones who say that she did have relationships are probably right. There seem to have been a number of men who were very close to her, but she never quite managed to trust them enough, or to feel perhaps that it was worth it. It was worth it to marry them. And we'll look at the reasons why it wouldn't be worth it for a queen to marry in a little while. Firstly, let's mention something a little bit more positive. She had, of course, two a half brother and a half sister, with both of them with different mothers, but they were all Henry's children. And she had a close relationship with her sister Mary, her elder sister, big sister Mary, who was the daughter of the Catholic Catherine, and we talked about her Bloody Mary. We talked about her last week and the burning of the Protestants and all of that. Elizabeth had a good relationship with her, which was lucky. This may later have saved her life. Okay? Because when Mary became queen, Elizabeth was kind of Mary's logical enemy. And Edward, the little boy prince, her younger brother, she also had a good relationship with him. So it seems she had some of the positive things of childhood, but some extraordinary and horrible negative experiences as well. So then, when Edward is the king, it's not a problem really. Edward is male. Seems like a pretty nice guy. He's only a kid, and he was only 9 years old when he starts. And Elizabeth has a good relationship with him, if any particular problem. But he dies, and then Mary becomes queen, and this now becomes a dangerous period for Elizabeth. It's a chance for her to show her intelligence, just to survive. All right? She could easily have had her head chopped off at this time, or been burned, or something. So, Catherine Parr, as the last wife of Henry VIII, was a powerful woman. She had a lot of respect, and she was able to protect Elizabeth. But then when she died, this was a difficult situation for Elizabeth, especially because Catherine's husband continued to take a sexual interest in her. And by this stage, she was a bit older, and he was perhaps aiming to marry her, which she clearly didn't want. And in addition to his amorous intentions towards Elizabeth, he was in his own little ambitious world of power. And he was trying to replace his brother as the protector of the boy king, the little boy, Edward. Well, he did not succeed in replacing his brother as the protector of Edward. And in those days, when you failed in something, you usually paid with your life. So that's what happens. He pays with his life. He's put to death. So at least Elizabeth can go, he's not going to there's not going to be any kind of sekuhara from him anymore. He had his head chopped off. Okay? So the only little danger about that situation was that there was a bit of suspicion that maybe she was supporting Thomas Seymour in his plot. A little kind of suspicion, but nobody could prove it, so that's it. They just left it. And she was relatively okay during Edward's lifetime. But it's when Mary came into power that Elizabeth is in the more serious danger. Thomas Wyatt was the leader of a rebellion against Mary, and again, Mary was suspected. Now this was a much more serious plot because it was directly against the Queen. Seymour's plot was just to replace become the protector of the king. He wasn't aiming to kill the king or anything, but still bad enough. But this was a more serious plot, and Mary, although she had no proof, she decided, well, I think I'll be careful, and I'll put put Elizabeth in prison in the Tower of London, which you can still see if you go to London. It's still there. And you think, wow, people are kept in here. It's like dungeons, thick walls, no possibility of escape. Except that it was usually privileged people, or many of the people who were in there were privileged. They would have servants, they would have comfortable beds. So she would be in prison, but she would be in reasonably comfortable circumstances as a member of the royal family. Yeah, basically, she was careful. She was just careful. She also realized, look, she had a Protestant mother. All right. Anne Boleyn was Protestant. But she knew enough to say, no, I'm not a Protestant. I believe in the Catholic Church, like you, Mary, I'm a Catholic. Okay, so she had enough sense to tell her sister, to tell her big sister that she believed in the Catholic religion, even though after Mary died, Elizabeth changed to, the Acock of Kilkye became a Protestant church. So she was just lying. But I mean, would you lie to save your life? Yep. I think she probably did the right thing there. When she was in prison, it's interesting. She wrote this little verse inside a Latin prayer book. The titles are in Latin. The chapter titles are in Latin here. The text here, this text is in Italian. She spoke all of these languages, no problem for her. And she's written this little verse, little poem. No crooked leg so bleared eye, no bearded eye, no part deformed out of kind, yet so only half can be as is the inward suspicious mind. No physical deformity is as ugly as a mind that suspects. Whose was the mind that suspected? Who would this be written for? Who suspected anything against Elizabeth? Mary, yeah, that's right. Her sister. It was her sister that had put her in prison. While she was in prison, she wrote this little verse in her prayer book, and it was exactly written to her. She probably kept that hidden when Mary was around because she wouldn't want to show it to her. Okay, saying, yeah, you suspect me, that makes you more ugly than somebody who's physically deformed. Right? It's horrible that a sister should suspect her own sister like that. No crooked leg, no bleared eye, no part deformed out of kind, nor yet so ugly half can be. Is this the inward suspicious mind? All right, written by Elizabeth during the time that she was imprisoned by Mary in the Tower of London. All right, then Mary dies and Elizabeth becomes queen. This process of becoming queen is called accession. Now, last week we talked about Mary not being able to have a child. So when Mary died with no child, there were two kind of possibilities for who might be the future leader, ruler of the country. So both of them had a connection with Henry, okay, Henry VIII. One was his sister, okay, who married the King of Scotland. and through that, we've got granddaughter Mary, Queen of Scots. Okay, so that was one line of possibility to say, oh well, if Henry had 3 children through 3 different marriages. He had Elizabeth first, then he had Mary, then he had Edward. Sorry, no, I've got it. That's not correct. He had Mary first, then he had Elizabeth, and then he had Edward. But Edward, of course, although he was younger, he was the first to be king, to take the throne after Henry died. Why did Edward become king before Mary became queen or Elizabeth became queen? Why would that be? First reason, yeah, because he was a boy. Second reason? The other 2 had been declared illegitimate. Okay? He had separated from Mary's mother and said, I'm not married to her. He had chopped off Elizabeth's mother and said, I'm not married to her. So they were both not legitimate children. So Edward was the first one to become the king. All right, so then he dies, so he's out of the picture. Mary is now the elder sister, and she becomes the queen, and then she dies, and so you've just got these 2. The granddaughter of Henry's sister, who married the King of Scotland, and his own illegitimate daughter, Elizabeth. So that was the kind of power struggle between these 2, which one of them would be the queen. And this is going to lead us to quite a detailed and quite interesting story. So, yeah, Elizabeth and Mary. Now, there's also a religious question going on here. Mary was on the Catholic side. The Scottish kings had kept close to Catholicism. Mary was on the Catholic side, whereas Elizabeth was on the Protestant side. Basically, Mary had spent most of her life in France. Does that seem strange for a Scottish princess? It's only a small thing, but I talked about it last week. Yeah, so Scotland and France had formed an alliance. Scotland and France were closer politically than Scotland and England. In fact, for hundreds of years, the closest country to Scotland was France. They didn't want any contact with the English. So lots of communication between Scotland and France, lots of ships going between the 2, lots of cultural communication. And so the 2 countries were very close. And actually it was France where Mary had mostly grown up. So at the particular time when I think I should clear this up. Please notice that there are 2 Marys here. I've had students writing term papers about her and thinking it was her. All right, so please get the 2 Marys clear in your mind. All right, you've got Mary, Queen of Scots, who's the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister, who married the Scottish king, and you've got Mary, who was Henry's first daughter. All right, they're both Catholics, but their history is very different. So Mary could not get enough support from Scotland because she wasn't in Scotland. She was in France, and she couldn't get enough support from the French because France was fighting against Protestants inside its own country at that time. France was busy. They didn't have time to help Mary. So Mary, Queen of Scots, lost the struggle, and Elizabeth became the Queen. And she seems to have been quite well welcomed. So let's take a look at this Mary, Queen of Scots, because she has an interesting story of her own. She was the main rival for the throne of England. Elizabeth became queen, and as was the usual situation, the loser had her head chopped off. But wait a minute. Elizabeth was not... But again, history is a little bit divided. Was Elizabeth sometimes Ijiwaru? Did she do more violent things than she needed to? Generally, people feel no, she didn't. I mean, some historians will say she was very nasty to the Catholics in some situations. But yes, she did have her cousin's head chopped off, but not for a long time. She didn't want to do it. All right, so this period, this long period when Mary was kept alive and Elizabeth was, treating her like a sister, kind of in prison. But when I say in prison, it was like living in a huge house with a very rich family, able to get on a horse and ride around the countryside, able to go here, write letters, do anything she wanted, just not go more than a certain distance away from the house. So it's a kind of prison, but a very nice prison. You'd probably think of it as an exceptionally good hotel, right? But a prison in the sense that she wasn't allowed to go completely away from that area. And yeah, the story between these two is an important story for history. It changes the way that English history develops. So I think we should take a little look at this. I'll say that again. Okay. So here we go. Let's find out a little bit about Mary and her story. I talked before about something called the Elizabethan settlement. Does anybody remember what it was? Does anybody remember what the Elizabethan settlement was? Not sure. It's okay. Actually, I'm kind of thinking, I talk all the time to you. I don't really know how much you understand what I say. Do you understand most of what I say? Do you understand at least half? Yeah? Okay, I mean, tell me if I'm going too quickly, or tell me if it's too difficult or something. But there is quite a lot of stuff like that. Words that you don't know, like monasteries or reformation or settlement. Now, the Elizabethan settlement is not the usual meaning of the word settle anyway, or settlement, which is usually when you pay money that you owe. Okay, settling your debts, for example. I have to pay you, 10,000 yen because you gave me 10,000 yen 6 months ago, and I should give it back. Okay, that's settlement. But this is a religious settlement. This is where she made the plan for Eikoku Kyokai, the Church of England. So the Elizabethan settlement is really when the Church of England becomes kind of stable in its identity, the same identity that more or less has today. Okay, so she made this settlement stabilizing England as a sort of moderately Protestant country. This picture in the background there is a picture of the ceremony where she was crowned in 1559, and it does seem like she was very popular at that point. Many people came into the streets to welcome the new queen. People seemed happy at the idea of having Elizabeth as a queen. It is a little bit difficult because there's a tendency among historians, especially from my generation, it was always Bloody Mary and Good Queen Bess. Bess is Elizabeth. Good Queen Bess. Historians are beginning to think Mary wasn't so bad. Okay, now I'm talking about this Mary. Okay, the Catholic Queen. And Elizabeth wasn't so good. All right. Those who liked the Protestant Church were probably happy to see Elizabeth. Those who liked the Catholic Church probably preferred Mary. So it was kind of a struggle. But there were plenty of people who supported Elizabeth at that time. So she came in as a ruler of the country in 1558, and the ceremony was in 1559. Now, the first thing she did was to make something called an Act of Supremacy, and this is part of the Elizabethan settlement. Part of the Act of Supremacy, which explains the identity of the Church of England, is the king or queen is the head of the church. That's the Act of Supremacy. It means that the king or the queen is the leader of the church. So anybody who had a public position had to accept her. They had to sign a piece of paper. They had to prove, I believe that I accept that the head of the church is Elizabeth. Catholics would say, no, the head of the church is the Pope, and they would lose their job. Okay, so if you wanted to keep your job, okay, I don't mean selling apples in a shop, you could do that, or something private like that. But if you were working in a public position, you had to swear that you accepted Elizabeth as the leader of the church and that you were not a Catholic. And then you get the Act of Uniformity. The Act of Uniformity said every church in the country has to use this prayer book. Every church in the country, misa wa kouyu kanji de shinai to ikenai. So the church service has to follow this pattern. So that was the second law that she made. Well, every church in the country has a kind of joshiki for the misa, a way of doing the church service. And it was a Protestant church service. Not as strongly Protestant as some other churches, but it was not Catholic. And that's what the Elizabethan settlement is. It's these two laws. Again, 専門的な言葉. Act, いろんな意味があります. It has several different meanings. ドラマの分けてるでしょ、部分に. Each part of a drama is an act. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Okay? Act is acting, an actor. Okay? Shakespeare. To be or not to be. Okay? That's act. Act is to do something. 何かやる. Okay? I don't like your act here. You're acting badly. Okay? Something like that. Act can be like action. But in this case, okay, in this case, an act means 法律, a law made by the government. An act is basically a law. So these two acts, these two laws, are the Elizabethan settlement, if you put them together. So here she is, Queen of England. Okay, now the clothes may make it a little bit difficult for you because of the way of dressing, but do you notice anything? Do you notice anything? Every single one of them is a man. Okay? Isn't that kind of extraordinary? They're all men. And the leader of them is a queen, a woman. And this was all really pretty unusual. Sometimes it had happened in the medieval period, but not often. It's the reason why Henry divorced or separated from his first wife. A woman can't lead all those men. And so he had all that trouble leaving separating from his first wife, chopping off the head of his second wife, and he had all of this trouble. But in the end, both his daughters were queen. Right? He might have been very surprised. Really? But that's what happened. So I think seeing her surrounded by, the Seijika, the parliament, this would be the parliament of the time, surrounded by all the politicians, all men, and you suddenly kind of understand the dynamic, the relationship. So, okay, I will be coming back a little bit to Mary, Queen of Scots, because she has a pretty important sort of life, and it's not finished. The story is not finished yet. But before I come back to that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the settlement and the church that she established. She did something, again, in legal terms. It was only a little thing in a way, but it made a big difference, and it changed people's thinking. Zutto anotoki kara. Before that, people were punished, for example, by Mary, also by Henry, and before this, people could be punished for a crime called heresy. Heresy means you don't believe the true religion. Okay, you are not a true member of my church. You are a traitor to my church. You follow a different church. My church teaches, we talked last week about one or two examples. My church teaches that Jesus' body is in the bread in the church ceremony. That Jesus' blood the wine is Jesus' blood. The bread is Jesus' body. My church teaches that. You believe it's only a symbol. You die. Your crime is heresy. You don't follow the true teaching of my church. Okay? Elizabeth changed this and made it political. She said basically, 信じても信じても何でも信じていいよ。別に気にしない。だから。You have to accept me and my church. You have to go to my church. You have to, even if you disagree, okay, just keep your true heart inside you and just come. Okay? If you just show, kind of tap in my face, I won't ask anymore. All right? Is that too much to ask? Okay? Just chotto dakyo shite. Okay? Even if you don't agree with my church, please, you have to come. Okay? So people who didn't conform to Elizabeth were not punished because of what they believed. okay, in their heart, they were punished because of their actions. I'm not going to punish you because you are a Catholic, but I'm going to punish you because you are spreading Catholic teaching, which says that I am not the leader of the church. You're spreading the teaching that the Pope is the leader of the church. Now, that is a political challenge to me. Suddenly, this difference of religion, the focus is not, do you believe it's the bread, or do you believe it's really his body, or that kind of question. The question is, are you a political danger to me? Or are you a political danger to this country? Are you challenging the political structure of this country? That was the focus from Elizabeth on of religious conflict in England. Okay? It's an important difference. Okay? The crime was of heresy no longer existed, or it could not be punished. The crime was treason. Okay? Committing heresy, no, that's not a problem. You can believe what you believe in your heart. I don't want to change it. But if that belief starts to challenge me or this country politically, then it's treason. You are an uragiri mono for your country. And that is a crime. Okay? It might not seem like a big difference to us today, but that was an important difference at the time. So, as we've said before, all through Elizabeth's reign, mostly during the 17th century, the Church of England was trying to be kind of in between Catholicism and Protestantism. And there were quite a few important people at the time, but there was one man especially, this man, Richard Hooker. He wrote a great big, well, eight books, okay, and each one is big. 8 books called The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, which is really, this is what our church is. Because it's bigger than the Bible, all right? This is what we believe, this is what our church teaches. So Elizabeth needed somebody to go through the Bible very carefully and to look at the arguments and to explain our Eikoku Kyokai believes that these are the things that we believe, these are the things that we follow, these are the kind of rules for our church. Okay? The next question, and after I've dealt with this question, I think I'll give you a little break for a few minutes. The next question is Elizabeth's marriage. Now, if you remember, her sister Mary did get married. Who did her sister Mary marry? The King of Spain. That's right, I think you're going to say the same thing. Yeah, the King of Spain, okay? Good. So the problems that came from that were that the British people were afraid, oh my God, we're going to lose control of our country. We're going to come under the control of Spain. Okay? Well, Elizabeth, it was the same sort of thing. If she married anybody, another king from another country, there was the risk that she would lose the control herself, and she'd have to give the control of the country to, the king of the country that she married. Okay? Or whoever she married, even if it was not a king of another country, whoever she married, the control would go from her to her husband. The man always had the control. Well, people supposed at the beginning that she would marry, because the usual thing, kings and queens, the usual thing, the first thing they wanted to do was marry. Why? Why was the first thing a king or queen wanted to do was It was really important for them to get married. Exactly. In order to have children, especially male children, so that the line continues. There's stability. If the king or queen has no children, especially no son, people are sort of looking, thinking, what's going to happen when they die? Or maybe even we could kill them and take power ourselves. Okay? It established stronger power for the king or queen to have a child, especially to have a son. So the expectation was that Elizabeth would marry. And probably the person that she was closest to over the years was a man called Robert Dudley. Unfortunately, Dudley, by this stage, was actually already married. Even more unfortunately was that his wife died. She fell downstairs. Was she pushed? Or she fell downstairs. Honestly, I found her here at the bottom of it. I was very upset. She'd fallen downstairs and there she was dead. Where were you when this happened? Oh, I don't know. I wasn't nowhere near. How do you know? How does anybody know? Right? In those days, they didn't have forensic science to kind of study the evidence. I see footmarks here, or the bruises on her shoulder that from somebody's hands. She was pushed. They didn't have that kind of way of investigating to find out the truth. But there was a kind of uwasa going round. He killed his wife so he could marry Elizabeth. And Elizabeth's advisors said, "Kono hito kekkon shinai hou ga ii." Okay, so uwasa ga aru kara. It won't be popular if you marry him. And of course, there were the usual kings and princes from other countries. Philip of Spain, Eric of Sweden, Charles of Austria, Henry and Francis of France, Dukes of Anjou in France, and I think one or two others actually. So quite a number of them were hoping that she would marry them. Notice Onaji Philippe this, okay? Spain no Osama. This was Mary's husband. Okay, he thinks, well, let's try for sister. Dudley was locked up in the Tower at the same time as Elizabeth. Remember, Elizabeth was put in the Tower of London by Mary, and they stayed friends all their lives. He was probably the closest person to her. Elizabeth is known as the Virgin Queen, and she presented herself to the public as, the Virgin Queen, never married, never had sex. As I say, a lot of historians say, actually, she did. She probably did. So he was not just her friend. He quite possibly was her lover, but they were not able to marry. King of Spain, as I say, he'd been Mary's husband, and he's going to be very important during the time of Elizabeth. They don't actually marry, but it's quite an important kind of relationship that grows up between them. Are you all right there? Yeah. But in the end, she never married any of them. She became known as the Virgin Queen. Okay, so yes, now as promised, I'd like to go back to the Scottish cousin, Mary Queen of Scots. She has an extraordinary life. story. For Elizabeth, Mary was a problem because she was a possible challenge, in fact, a strong challenge to become queen. Who do you think, which people do you think especially wanted to kill Elizabeth and make Mary the queen? The Catholic people, yeah. I mean, you could have thought the Scottish people because she was the Queen of Scotland. She had some Scottish supporters, but no, that wasn't the big problem. You could have said the French because she was culturally close to France and she grew up in France, but again, that wasn't the big problem. The big problem was that she was a symbol for the Catholics of England, who dreamt of putting her on the throne and having a Catholic country again. Well, as I said, the normal thing in those days was for Elizabeth just to chop her head off, but Elizabeth didn't want to do that. But we'll come to that slowly. Now, yeah, when I say she had an extraordinary life, she was only 1 week old when she became Queen of Scotland. I mean, 1 week old and she's done more than I'll ever do in my life. Well, she was queen of a country before she was, when she was just a tiny little baby. All right? So, 1 point for her. Very big point. And then, when she's just 6 months old, she's engaged to be married. Okay? We're too late. We're never going to have a life like Mary, okay? She was queen when she was a week old. She was engaged to be married when she was 6 months old. She started young. Actually, that didn't work because Henry VIII's son. What was Edward's religion? Henry VIII's son, Edward. What was his religion? Protestant, exactly. And the Catholic supporters in Scotland of Mary said, no, we don't want our Catholic Mary marrying that Protestant Edward. No. Children, stop it. And so the engagement was cut off. And they, instead of saying, let's Scotland make friends with England through a royal marriage, let's keep on being friends with France. We've been friends with France for hundreds of years. They've never tried to attack us. They've never tried to take control of our country, like the English. You get too close to the English, you get too friendly with the English, and the next thing you know, they want to control your country. They're like that. Which is true. Right? I mean, it's true. Look at the British Empire later on. Okay? Hi, Wanda, do you have bananas here? I mean, in your country? Yeah, we've got bananas. Great, can we? Yeah, you can have some of our bananas. Great, what are you doing? Oh, we're coming into your shop. Take my bananas. No, that's all right, we don't care. We're taking them. It's our country now. Okay. British Empire. Bananas, tobacco, sugar, metals, cotton, anything really. All right. And really, that's the other aspect of our story today. The British Empire really kind of begins with Elizabeth. So, yeah, the Scottish didn't trust the English, and quite right too. They wanted to keep on being friendly with France. So, again, she starts young. She gets married when she's 15. Her husband becomes king the next year. So she gets married. She's king of Scotland. She's Queen of Scotland from the time she's a little baby. She marries a French prince when she's 15. He becomes the King of France. So at the age of 16, she becomes the Queen of France. Then he dies. Okay? So, by the time she's, the age of you people coming to university, think of all the things that have happened in her life. All right? It's extraordinary, isn't it, really? Her husband died, and she decided to go back to Scotland. Now, this was a dangerous move because now Scotland was moving more and more towards being a Protestant country. So it was a little bit dangerous for her to go back to Scotland. There were still, quite a lot of Catholics around, but they were losing to the Protestants. The Protestants were becoming more and more powerful in the country. So a bit risky for her to go back to Scotland, but she does. The big Protestant reformer in Scotland was this man, John Knox, and he succeeded in spreading the Protestant religion through large parts of Scotland. So, in the end, she married her cousin, Lord Darnley. Now, again, the marriage to Lord Darnley, okay, Mary married her cousin. Sounds simple, sounds easy, yeah? But the whole story, here's the story. Her husband murders Mary's secretary. Okay, so husband, what have you done? I've killed your secretary. And then, husband, where are you? I've been murdered. So he kills her secretary, probably because he's jealous of her. The secretary thinks something's going on, and then he gets killed. And who killed her husband? Probably a man called James Hepburn. And what do you think Mary did next? Come on, if you were writing an exciting novel, okay, and this woman, her secretary is killed by her husband, and then her husband is killed, and somebody is suspected of killing her husband, what's going to make the novel even more exciting? To get married to the guy who's suspected of killing your husband. Okay, it's serious. It's just like it's like reading an adventure novel, isn't it? This was a big scandal for the Scottish people. It was hugely unpopular, and she was forced to abdicate. Another of those symbol picking up about abdicate, to leave her position as queen. And she ran away to England and left the throne of Scotland to her one-year-old son, James VI. So, first mention of James VI. He's also going to be important in our story. Does anybody have any idea why James VI is going to be important to our story? He's going to be the first king of the Stuart king of England. So when the Tudor family dies and Elizabeth has no children, he's going to be the next king. Okay, so she has her head chopped off. All right, but her son, okay, he becomes king of Scotland and of England. Okay, but that's going to be the next step. That's going to be the next story when we talk about Juna Naseki, the 17th century. We'll move on to his story. But here he is now. He's just 1 year old at the time, and because his mother has run off, leaving her child, that's another thing, I've got to get out of this country. I've got to get out of this country. Madam, Mary, your son. Okay, I've got to get out of here. Okay, and she left her son behind at the age of 1 year old. Okay, I don't suppose he had much love for her. He wouldn't know her, would he? So she ran off to England, hoping that Elizabeth would protect her from the Scottish people who were, they were going to put her in prison, for marrying this man that they thought he was a murderer. They might have killed her, they might have put her to death. Certainly they wanted to catch her, they wanted to punish her. Like I say, it's a fantastic story. You couldn't make it up, okay? I mean, wow. Okay? I mean, if Agatha Christie or a famous, Murakami Haruki, or, if they made up a story like that, I would say, wow, that's great, okay? What a fantastic story. Well, this is a true one, okay? And it gets better, or depending on your way of thinking, it gets worse, because, of course, in the end, she's going to get her head chopped off. So let's look at how that happens. Mary was expecting that Elizabeth would support her to become Queen of Scotland again. But Elizabeth was not really interested in saying, let's send a lot of soldiers to fight in Scotland and support Mary to be Queen. それより自分のことを守った方がいい. I better protect myself against Mary, because the Catholic supporters will choose Mary to be their queen and they will try to kill me. So Mary was a risk. And there were about 20 times people tried to kill Elizabeth. Catholic supporters were the main people who were trying to kill Elizabeth. There were at least 20 different attempts to kill Elizabeth. And basically, yes, they wanted Mary to be queen instead. So it's too dangerous for Elizabeth to let Mary go free. But it seems like, as I said, one reason for thinking she's not like her father, for example, kind of Ijiwaru, just, chop his head off and his head off and, his as well. Henry just sort of had people's heads chopped off kind of almost for fun, okay? No, she wasn't like that, and she didn't want to harm her cousin Mary. She had her kind of in a sort of prison, but living in a luxurious kind of environment. But in the end, Mary was shown to be involved in one of those Catholic plots against Elizabeth. As long as Mary could say, I didn't know that anybody was trying to kill you. I didn't communicate with those people. It's not my fault that they're trying to kill you. But finally, Mary, we've got proof. We've got letters. Okay? We know you were in contact with those people. Sorry, Mary. You crossed the line. All right? We've got proof that you were working together with people who want to kill me. I can't just forgive you. So Elizabeth had little choice but to put Mary to death. There it was. One of the most famous and beautiful women in Europe, and she was dead. In 1587, it's said that the executioner was possibly drunk, but he didn't manage to kill her on the first stroke of the axe. Can you think about the practicality of that? It must have been so disgusting. Sometimes the executioner would have to swing the axe several times. Okay? じゃあもう一回やってみますね。ごめんね。Blood coming out, sometimes they had to try several times, before they actually succeeded in chopping the head off. What a disgusting scene, okay? In her case, it took 2 blows. And then for the people watching, because people would watch this kind of thing, when he went to pick up her head, her beautiful hair, you know, that she was famous for being so beautiful. It was a wig. So and they held up the bald head. Quite again, you know, her ending was just as dramatic as her beginning. So now we're moving to the later part of Queen Elizabeth's reign and war with Spain. Spain being the most powerful country in Europe at this time. Now, King Philip was very patient with Elizabeth for a very long time. He was patient when she refused to marry him. He was patient when English ships attacked and plundered Spanish ships returning from the Americas. I went to live in Spain when I was about 18 years old, and the Spanish people would tell me about a pirate called Drake. I was shocked. You see, this is something to think about history. If I'm English, growing up in England, this pirate called Drake was a big hero. When I was a schoolboy, he was a big hero. In fact, he was a pirate, really. The Spanish are right. The Spanish would go to America, kill lots of people, and bring back lots of gold. Francis Drake would wait for them, and when they got close, he would attack their ships and say, thank you very much. I'll take that gold, and I'll kill you. He was a pirate. But why did Queen Elizabeth accept him? Because he would take all the gold to Elizabeth and he'd say, Your Majesty, we have gold for you. And she would say, you're a great guy. You can keep half of it and I'll have the other half. Okay? So she treated him like a hero, when really he was a pirate. And the King of Spain was very patient. You know, he kept on talking, Elizabeth, please don't do this. You know, I mean, if somebody was, you know, killing your navy, would you just be sort of saying, oh, please don't do that? I mean, he was being very, very patient. I think he possibly, for a long time, had some hope that perhaps she would marry him. He was even patient when she made an alliance with Protestants in the Netherlands. Imano Oranda. Oranda wa Spain no Spain wa Oranda o control shite. Spain was controlling the Netherlands, and Spain's a Catholic country. It wanted Catholic control in the Netherlands. Elizabeth supported the Protestants in the Netherlands. Even then, Philip is still being patient with Elizabeth. But the time came when he said, "Mo takusan." And that was the time when she chopped off Mary's head. It's something, for some reason, that was too much for him. And he said, okay, more takusan. So he saw this. So that's when the Spanish Navy, the Spanish Armada, it was called, attacked England. And here you can see the different flags, the Spanish flag with the red and yellow and the lion, I think it's a lion on it, and the English flag with the Union Jack. Is that right? Have I got that right? Yeah, I think I'm not quite sure. Because you've got the red and yellow flag with the cross. I think, anyway, yeah, the red and yellow with the cross is certainly Spain, and the white and red is England. I think you might notice something. Do you notice anything about the Spanish ships compared to the English ships? Maybe not completely easy to see it. No, maybe not too easy to see it. Yeah, a little bit difficult to understand, to kind of be sure about that. In fact, the Spanish ships were usually much, much bigger than the English ships. The English ships were much smaller. And because of this, the English ships could change direction and move around very quickly. And although Spain was famous for you've got the biggest ships in the world, yeah, but little ships can move around more quickly. Boom, 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 boom. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, we can attack from here, we can attack from there, we can attack you from different positions and get away again before you can attack us. And Spain lost. Spain, with its navy, which they call the Invincible Armada, the navy that cannot be beaten, in fact, was not invincible. It was beaten. It's also true that a big storm came up and blew many of the Spanish ships out into the sea. Some of them ended up in Ireland. Imademo, Spain no miogino airurando jinga iru. Okay, there are Spanish people, even for example, the first, when Ireland became an independent country, the leader of the country was a man called Eamon de Valera. De Valera is a Spanish name. Okay, they said de Valera. Okay, they pronounced it in a, not in a Spanish way, but it's a Spanish name. Okay, and those are from those sailors who were blown away during that storm and settled in Ireland. Okay, and there were hundreds of them. So the weather helped England, but for whatever reason, England won and Spain lost. And continuing from that time, Spain had been the strongest country in Europe. England was not really a very powerful country. From that time on, Spain went down, slowly down, 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 and down in its power. And England went up, 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 up in its power, all through the next several hundred years. So when the Spanish Armada set off to attack in 1588, Spain was the greatest power in Europe. England was fairly unimportant. When England actually beat the Spanish Armada, the balance of power shifted and Spain began to lose its grip and England became steadily stronger.